On a cold December morning in 1941, a single radio transmission would shatter Winston Churchill's 2 years of desperate isolation and give him the first real sleep he'd had since the war began. Pearl Harbor had been struck. The Japanese attack came without warning on December 7th, and when the news reached Churchill at Chequers, his country estate, where he spent weekends away from the chaos of wartime London, something inside the British Prime Minister finally released. He would pen in his diary later that he experienced the most peaceful rest of his life that evening, describing it as the slumber of those who have been rescued and are profoundly grateful. For 24 long months, Britain had stood essentially isolated against the Nazi war machine. Churchill had witnessed his cities consumed by flames during the relentless Blitz. He had written countless letters, made impassioned pleas, and employed every diplomatic tool at his disposal to draw America into the conflict. And now, finally, his prayers had been answered. The United States would enter the war. Yet Churchill grasped something that December night that would require many months to become reality. Understanding that America had committed to fight was entirely different from witnessing actual American soldiers standing on British ground, their boots marching on British cobblestones, tangible and present, and prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with his war-weary people. That transformation would prove to be something altogether different. Churchill's pursuit of American partnership had begun even before the first shots were fired. Serving as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1939, and then ascending to Prime Minister in May 1940, he had composed message after message to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Their correspondence became legendary, totaling more than 1,700 communications throughout the war years. Churchill's signature on these letters read former naval person initially, a nod to his Admiralty position, creating a personal connection that circumvented traditional diplomatic protocol. Their relationship operated on multiple levels, both calculated strategy and genuine emotional bond. Churchill's maternal lineage was American, his mother Jenny Jerome having been born in Brooklyn, New York. He had always maintained deep ties to America, had traveled extensively across the nation, and counted many Americans among his friends. But beyond personal sentiment, he possessed a clear-eyed understanding of Britain's requirements. Following France's collapse in June 1940, Britain found itself the sole Western European nation still resisting Hitler. The Soviet Union remained bound to its non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany. Churchill required America to be more than a source of weapons and provisions. He needed American forces in the field, fighting alongside British troops. The Lend-Lease Act, approved by the American Congress in March 1941, had provided crucial assistance. American vessels delivered tanks, aircraft, munitions, and food supplies in quantities that kept Britain functioning. However, cargo and equipment were not infantrymen. They could not secure territory or launch assaults on fortified positions throughout 1941, as German forces penetrated deep into Soviet territory following Hitler's June invasion. Churchill observed and anticipated and desperately hoped that some event would compel America to commit troops. Pearl Harbor accomplished what all his eloquent speeches and private correspondence could not achieve. On December 8th, America declared war on Japan. 3 days afterward, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Churchill immediately began preparations for a journey to Washington to meet with Roosevelt face to face. He landed on American soil December 22nd and remained through the new year, engaging in intensive discussions about strategy, synchronizing military plans, and constructing the alliance structure that would need to achieve victory. But conference rooms in Washington represented abstract concepts. The genuine proof would materialize when American soldiers actually set foot in Britain. The initial contingent, of American troops disembarked in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. These were advance units, relatively small in number, the first drops of what would become a torrential flood. Throughout the spring months and into summer of 1942, more continued arriving. By year's end, over 100,000 American servicemen were stationed across Britain. By D-Day in June 1944, that figure would surpass 1.5 million. They traveled by ship, navigating the Atlantic in heavily guarded convoys, constantly vigilant for German U-boats lurking beneath the waves. They came ashore at Liverpool, at Belfast, at numerous ports scattered around the British Isles. The overwhelming majority were young, many experiencing their first journey beyond American borders. They discovered themselves in a nation that had endured more than 2 years of total war, a country defined by severe rationing, bomb-scarred buildings, and bone-deep exhaustion. The British response to the American presence proved complex and contradictory. Genuine appreciation existed, certainly. These young men were arriving to provide assistance, to combat a shared enemy threatening civilization itself. Yet friction developed almost immediately. To British eyes, the Americans appeared impossibly prosperous. American soldiers received significantly higher pay than their British counterparts. They had access to consumer goods that ordinary British citizens hadn't encountered in years. Their uniforms were superior quality, their rations far more generous. The American military provisioned its personnel with items that seemed almost offensive to a population surviving on rations that had been progressively reduced month after month. The famous expression emerged from British lips: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It was typically delivered with humor, but humor containing a sharp edge of resentment. British soldiers earning a fraction of American wages watched American GIs escort British women to dances and public houses. British families subsisting on rations, permitting for ounces of bacon per person weekly, heard stories about American mess halls serving steaks and ice cream. But underneath the friction runs something more profound. Hope, relief, a growing sense that perhaps the tide of war might actually reverse course. Churchill felt this more intensely than anyone in Britain. He comprehended the brutal mathematics of the conflict. Germany had conquered the vast majority of Europe. German armies were massive, German factories producing armaments at staggering rates. Britain was maintaining its position, but maintaining position was not achieving victory. The Soviet Union was absorbing the primary force of German military power, but the Eastern Front was geographically distant, and the outcome remained uncertain. Britain required America's industrial capacity, its seemingly inexhaustible resources, its fresh divisions of soldiers. He had monitored the supply ships arriving, had tracked the statistics, had authorized plans for American military bases and training facilities across Britain. But seeing the men themselves, watching them march information through British streets, would make everything tangible in a way that logistics reports and strategic planning documents never could. The moment arrived on an overcast afternoon in London. The specific date matters less than what the occasion represented. American forces were being transferred through the city, a substantial formation marching in military order from one railway station to another. These were not the first Americans Churchill had encountered in Britain by this stage. Several months into 1942, American soldiers had become a familiar presence. But this was fundamentally different. This was an official march through the heart of London, through streets that had been bombed during the Blitz, past structures still displaying damage from German air raids. Churchill ensured his presence. He positioned himself at a location offering an unobstructed view. His staff understood better than to interfere. When the Prime Minister wished to personally witness something meaningful, they arranged for him to observe clearly, from a position where he could stand and watch without creating excessive disruption. The Americans approached marching in tight columns, their boots striking the pavement in synchronized rhythm. They wore their standard-issue uniforms, their helmets secured, rifles carried at the proper angle. They were predominantly young men, most between 18 and 22 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, factory laborers from Detroit, office clerks from New York City. They had completed training at camps scattered across America, had crossed the Atlantic in overcrowded troop transport ships, had arrived in a country actively engaged in total war. They marched with the distinctive bearing characteristic of American soldiers, perhaps less rigid than British military discipline demanded, but radiating confidence. They recognized they were participating in something monumental. They had grown up hearing stories about the Great War, about American doughboys going over there to fight in France during 1917 and 1918. Now they were following that same path, retracing those historic footsteps, traveling to Europe to fight another war against Germany. London crowds assembled to observe them passing. Office workers emerged from buildings. Shopkeepers stood framed in doorways. Citizens lined the sidewalks several people deep. Some applauded, some waved small flags. Children shouted greetings to them. The Americans smiled broadly, returned the waves, maintained their disciplined formation. Churchill observed in silence initially. His eyes tracked along the columns, absorbing the sight. His face, normally highly expressive, became difficult to interpret. Those positioned near him later recalled that moisture gathered in his eyes. He had spent 2 years bearing the crushing weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders. 2 years delivering speeches, rallying the British people, making agonizing decisions about allocating desperately limited resources. 2 years watching young British men depart to fight in North Africa, in the Mediterranean theater, in the skies above Germany. 2 years reading casualty lists, visiting bombed cities, knowing with absolute certainty that Britain was stretched beyond its breaking point. And now here stood the Americans, thousands of them, with thousands more en route. An entire nation's military strength being deployed to Britain, preparing to carry the fight to Hitler's fortress Europe. Someone standing near Churchill inquired what he was thinking. The Prime Minister remained silent for a long moment, continuing to observe the marching troops. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the accumulated emotion of those 2 years of standing virtually alone. "When I see these young men," he said, "I know we are going to win this war." The statement was simple, but it bore tremendous significance. Churchill was not prone to baseless optimism. He possessed a thorough understanding of modern warfare's realities, comprehended how arduous the road ahead would prove. The invasion of France remained 2 years distant. The Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats was reaching its most critical phase. The North African campaign remained undecided. Soviet forces were locked in a desperate struggle at Stalingrad. But observing the Americans marching through London, seeing the physical embodiment of American commitment, Churchill permitted himself to believe in victory not merely as a possibility, but as an inevitability. He elaborated, addressing those surrounding him, his words flowing in that characteristic Churchill fashion. Phrases building upon phrases in carefully constructed rhetoric. "They are so young, so strong, so confident," he said, watching another column pass. "Look at them carefully. They have traveled 3,000 miles to assist us. They have come to fight for freedom, for civilization, for everything we have been defending these terrible years." His voice gained strength and conviction. Hitler has committed his gravest error. He assumed America would maintain neutrality, would remain detached from Europe's wars. He assumed Britain would collapse or surrender. He was catastrophically wrong on both counts. Now he confronts not merely Britain, not merely Russia, but America as well, the greatest industrial power on Earth. the greatest reserve of manpower and resources, all of it now dedicated to his complete destruction. Churchill paused, retrieving his handkerchief to wipe his eyes. He felt no embarrassment about the tears. "I have waited so long for this," he said quietly. "So terribly long." The people around him understood perfectly. They had lived through identical years, experienced identical fears. The summer of 1940, when German invasion seemed imminent and inevitable. The Blitz when London burned night after night for weeks. The catastrophic losses at sea as U-boats sank merchant vessel after merchant vessel. The defeats in France, in Greece, in Crete. The desperate defensive campaign in North Africa. The constant unspoken question. How long can we possibly hold out? The Americans represented the answer, not just military power, though that was absolutely crucial. They represented vindication of everything Churchill had advocated for, everything he had worked toward with single-minded determination. His careful cultivation of Roosevelt, his speeches about Anglo-American partnership, his fundamental belief that the English-speaking peoples would ultimately stand united. All of it was being proven correct in the most concrete way imaginable. As the march continued, Churchill's mood transitioned from emotional to analytical. He began indicating specific details to his staff. "Notice their equipment," he said. "Modern, expertly manufactured. They possess the industrial capacity to equip millions of men to this standard. Millions." He studied their faces intently. They are eager, genuinely eager. They want to fight. That eagerness will cost some of them their lives, tragically. But it will also carry them through circumstances that exhausted men simply cannot endure. He was already thinking ahead strategically, planning how to harness this American energy, how to combine British experience with American strength and resources. "We must train them properly," he said. "They are brave but inexperienced. We have been fighting for 2 years. We have learned lessons they have not yet encountered. We must teach them what we have learned, and we must be humble enough to learn from them as well." Someone mentioned the growing friction between British and American troops, the complaints about pay disparities and American abundance amid British scarcity. Churchill dismissed it with an impatient gesture. "Of course there is friction. Place any two groups of young men together in close quarters, and there will inevitably be friction. But they are on our side. That is what matters fundamentally. They are here. They are real. And they are going to help us achieve victory." The march consumed over an hour. Column after column of American soldiers passing through London. Churchill remained for its entirety, observing until the final troops had disappeared from view. He seemed reluctant to depart, as if the sight was sustaining him, nourishing something he had been running on empty reserves for far too long. When it finally concluded, he turned to his staff. "I want to meet some of them," he said. "Arrange for me to visit an American base. I want to speak with these young men, want to thank them personally." The visits were organized over the subsequent months. Churchill made a deliberate point of visiting American units stationed throughout Britain. He would arrive unannounced sometimes, or with minimal advance warning, wanting to observe the troops as they actually existed. Not prepared for formal inspection, he would walk through their encampments, engage with small groups, inquire where they were from, what they thought of Britain, whether they were being treated properly. The American soldiers were frequently startled to encounter the British Prime Minister suddenly appearing in their midst. Churchill was immediately recognizable. The round, stocky figure, the bulldog face, the ever-present cigar clamped between his teeth. He would shake hands vigorously, tell jokes, ask questions. He wanted them to understand they were appreciated, wanted them to grasp what their presence meant to Britain. At one camp, he encountered a group of soldiers from Texas. "Texas," he exclaimed with enthusiasm. "I have visited Texas. magnificent state, vast and filled with energy. You Texans are renowned for your fighting spirit. We shall require exactly that spirit in the days ahead." The soldiers grinned broadly, pleased that this famous British leader possessed knowledge about their home state. At another base, he met soldiers who had just recently arrived, who were still processing the reality of being in Britain, so far from home. "You have traveled a tremendous distance," Churchill told them seriously. "You have left behind your homes, your families, everything familiar and comfortable. You have come to a country that has been at war for over 2 years, that is tired and worn down. But I tell you this with complete sincerity, your arrival has elevated our spirits more than you can possibly comprehend. When we see you, we see hope. We see strength. We see victory." He meant every single word. Churchill understood symbolism, understood the tremendous power of morale and psychological warfare. But this transcended mere symbolism. The Americans represented genuine military power, actual divisions that could be deployed operationally, real air squadrons that could conduct bombing raids on German cities, real naval vessels that could protect convoys. The strategic implications were staggering. Churchill and his military chiefs began planning operations that would have been utterly impossible before American entry. North Africa could be substantially reinforced. An invasion of Italy could be seriously contemplated. And eventually, the massive invasion of France could be methodically planned. Operation Overlord. D-Day. The enormous amphibious assault that would require American troops, American landing craft, American air superiority, American logistical support, American everything. But in that specific moment, watching the Americans march through London, Churchill was not calculating specific operations. He was contemplating what it signified that these men were present at all. For 2 years, Britain had continued fighting, but always with the terrible question overshadowing everything. Can we actually win? Can we defeat Germany? Or are we simply delaying the inevitable? The Americans provided the answer. Yes, Britain could win. Not alone, certainly, but with allies. With American industrial might and Soviet manpower, and British determination and experience. Yes, Germany could be defeated. Churchill had declared in his famous speech following Dunkirk in June 1940. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was magnificent defiance, stirring rhetoric that rallied a nation. But defiance based on willpower and determination, not certainty of victory. Now, watching the Americans march through London, he could have penned a new certainty. And we shall win. The relationship between British and American forces would encounter its share of challenges. Significant disagreements emerged about strategy. Churchill advocated attacking Germany through what he termed the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy and the Balkans. The Americans, particularly General George C. Marshall, insisted on a direct assault across the English Channel into France. Tensions developed regarding command structures, about who would lead combined operations. The inevitable cultural clashes occurred between British and American soldiers with different traditions and expectations. But beneath all those challenges existed the fundamental reality that Churchill grasped that day, observing the march. America was in the war, fully and irrevocably committed. And that transformed everything. The young men marching through London that afternoon would deploy to North Africa, to Sicily, to Italy, to France, ultimately to Germany itself. Many would die. American casualties in the European theater would exceed 300,000, with over 100,000 killed in action. They would fight at locations whose names would become legendary, seared into history. Omaha Beach, the Bulge, the Hurtgen Forest, the Rhine Crossing. But they would win, alongside British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces, alongside the massive Soviet armies grinding relentlessly forward from the east. The Americans would help systematically crush Nazi Germany. The war would continue another 3 years beyond that march through London, 3 years of brutal, grinding combat. But the outcome, from the moment America fully committed its strength, was ultimately determined. Churchill knew this, standing there watching the Americans pass. He knew it with certainty. The emotion he experienced, the tears gathering in his eyes, stemmed from relief as much as joy. Relief that the crushing burden would be shared. Relief that Britain would not have to stand alone anymore. Relief that victory had become possible, not merely as a desperate hope, but as a realistic, achievable objective. In his memoirs composed after the war, Churchill would return repeatedly to the theme of Anglo-American partnership. He would write extensively about the special relationship between Britain and America, would argue passionately for maintaining close ties in the post-war world. Some of this was strategic calculation, certainly. Britain would require American support in the Cold War that followed, but some of it was genuine emotion, born in those dark years when American assistance meant the difference between survival and annihilation. The march through London was not the first occasion Churchill saw American troops in Britain, and it would not be the last. But it represented something crucial, the moment when American involvement transformed from diplomatic agreements and shipping manifests to actual soldiers marching through British streets. Churchill had spent 2 years holding Britain together through sheer force of will and eloquent rhetoric. He had delivered speeches that rallied the nation from despair, had made agonizing decisions that kept Britain in the fight, had worked tirelessly to construct the alliance that would ultimately win the war. But will and eloquence could only accomplish so much. Eventually, you needed armies, needed soldiers, needed the physical power to strike back effectively. The Americans brought that power, and watching them march through London, Churchill allowed himself to believe fully, perhaps, for the first time since becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, that Britain would not merely survive but would win decisively. When I see these young men, he had said, I know we are going to win this war. It was not a boast designed for propaganda. It was not empty rhetoric. It was a statement of fact, spoken by a man who had carried the overwhelming weight of Britain's survival for 2 years, and who could finally, watching those American soldiers march past, set that weight down and share it with allies who possessed the strength to help carry it forward. The war would grind onward. There would be setbacks and losses, agonizing decisions and terrible casualties that would scar a generation. But the fundamental equation had changed irreversibly. Germany now confronted not just Britain's stubborn defiance, but America's industrial and military might. And that, Churchill understood with complete clarity. Watching those young Americans march through London streets would make all the difference between defeat and victory.